Welcome everyone to Cochrane Canada Live webinar session for the Fall 2011 series. As I mentioned, my name is Eileen Villas and I'm the Knowledge Broker at the Canadian Cochrane Centre. I hope everyone is feeling great today. I think in Ottawa here we've come out of the rain into the sunlight. At least that's the last time I checked, and I hope you're experiencing some of that sun today too. Please send me a smiley face if you are having a good day. Thank you. Well, I wanted to take a moment to thank the funding agencies of the Canadian Cochrane Centre, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and the support of some of their research institutes, which are listed here. I would also like to offer special recognition to the Research, Prevention, and Development Division of the Pan American Health Organization, or PAHO, the regional office of the WHO for the Americas, for their provision of the Illuminate Live platform that we are using for today's webinar. Thank you to PAHO, a valued partner of the Canadian Cochrane Centre. Today's webinar is titled Communicating Using Graphs, and that will cover some basic principles of graphic communication in healthcare. We are honored to have Dr. Charlie Goldsmith presenting today. Charlie received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in statistics from the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. After teaching at Carleton University in Ottawa for 2 years, he received his PhD in experimental design with a minor in mathematical statistics at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. He then returned to Canada when McMaster started its medical school and has been there for his entire career. Until January 31st, 2010, he was an Emeritus Professor of Biostatistics in the Department of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics at McMaster University. As of September 1st, 2010, he is the Maureen and Millen Ilk Merrick Chair in Statistics for Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Diseases. He is also a professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University. Charlie has been involved in a variety of studies related to musculoskeletal and surgical conditions. Most recently, the Cervical Overview Group, which conducts Cochrane reviews of therapy for patients with neck pain, and the Cochrane collaboration at McMaster University. He is a member of several editorial boards of health-related journals and has interests in quality improvement, experimental design, study design, and analysis. With this introduction, I would like to turn the session over to Dr. Goldsmith.
Thank you, Eileen. I welcome everybody, and I'm hoping you're having a great day. And so far it's a little cloudy here in Vancouver, but I'm sure we're going to have some fun today. A couple of issues. I'm quite happy to have you interrupt me along the way and raise questions, either by, as Eileen said, typing them in at the bottom, where you can send it to us and we will see the question written out, or you can raise your hand, and when there's a suitable break in the conversation, I'll recognize people for questions by turning off my mic and giving you an opportunity. Just a couple of other general things that weren't in the bio that Eileen read. In my editing of a variety of different journal articles, I have found that most people don't pay attention to what I consider to be the elementary principles of graphic display. And so what I'm going to do today is to spend some time with them and show you some examples, show you some alternative ways of displaying your data, and inviting you to raise questions about whether you think that they add clarity to the presentation. There is a term that I like to use when I read a graph in a manuscript that's being submitted as to whether it's an audiovisual aid or an audiovisual impediment. And I would say most are on the impediment side, and I think could be dramatically improved by some very simple things most of which we're going to get a chance to look at today. Okay, the next thing that I like to do is to use a date notation. If you notice under my name and the CC webinar that's listed there, there's a numerical date for today. And indeed, that is the Canadian standard, which it's been since 1978, that starts with the largest and goes to the smallest year, month, day. It's not the same as the British or American system, but it is the only sensible system, exclamation mark. So I prefer to use that all the time, and there will be a couple of other options that you will find that I'm going to use some dates, and when that happens, I'm going to use that date format. The second major comment is that I have a handout that I'm updating at the moment, and Eileen will make it available to you, and you're welcome to make use of the ideas that are there. It's a summary of a variety of books that I've read on graphic display with the principles that are in them. It reinforces many of the ideas that are here. It's written in text. It has references and citations that I will leave out of this display. I may mention the odd a reference, but I'm not going to give you the exact citation in our session today. So I'm looking forward to trying this out, and I hope that you will enjoy some of the choices that I've made for graphs, and so I look forward to getting on with it. So let's go on to the session. First of all, I don't have any conflict of interest that I know of with this stuff, other than I'm trying to help people improve the graphics that they have. But I don't have any funding to do this, and I don't have any shares or anything in any company that produces graphic displays, even though I will comment on the good and bad features about some of them as we go. So what we hope to do today is, one, try to introduce some principles of good graphic communication. I'm going to illustrate it with a little bit of data that I collected from a journal that I'm on the editorial board for. It stands for PDS, which is the Pharmacoepidemiology and Drug Safety is the title of the journal. I'm just going to use PDF. I'm going to show you some data that I collected from 76 graphs that were published in 2003, and they show some of the problems that could be fixed in those. And then what I'm going to do is to get right into some graphs and show you what I consider to be better graphic displays. I put a question there because I want to see if you're convinced by that by showing you some different options. And then I want to try you out to see if the principles that we're talking about that you can see them in the graphs and maybe even suggest how they might be improved. And hopefully we'll have enough time for questions, and certainly I'm up to getting emails, and you will see on the very last slide I've got my email address, phone number, fax number, that kind of stuff in case you want to get a hold of me if you have a particular question or want a question about a resource that could be used to help you produce better graphs. So let's get right into it. This is information that I took from 76 graphs in Pharmacoepidemiology and Drug Safety in 2003. The improvements are listed down here, and I'm going to go over each of them. The first number is how often they showed up and what number of graphs that they showed up in. For example, the graph that should have used a right-hand axis label that didn't. That happened in 48 graphs, and I've converted that into a percentage of 63%. So, and I would say, well, PDS is only one journal. Many journals would have the same sort of problem. So I think this is a very important one, and I'll show you why when we get into some data examples, why this is an important feature, and see whether you agree with me. That people tend to put data values in their graph space, and by doing that they sometimes confuse the interpretation of their data, and so that should be below the graph labels outside the graph. I'm not planning to show you an example of this today, but I do have some that are there. The other thing that it really shows up fairly often, 41% of the time, is that many graphics packages automatically get the y-axis label to be vertical. And that means those of you who are looking at a graph will have to turn your head 90 degrees to the left to be able to try and read it, or it might go by before you even can decode it. And so to me that makes it a graphic impediment rather than a graphic aid. And so I think we should make y-axis labels horizontal. And not all packages will allow you to do that, and I'll comment on that at the right time. The legend for the data should be outside the data region. The data region, by the way, is where all of the data are graphed, and you can see that that happens fairly often. Some people even leave off the x-axis itself. That happened 22% of the time, which was very surprising. And a lot of people put in too many zeros in the labels that they put on the y-axis, and in fact we can deal with that by various powers of 10, for example. But that's a less common problem, but it does show up fairly often. And then sometimes people leave the axis labels off, so unless you know the context of that particular graph, you don't even know what it's supposed to be telling you. And while those only happen about 1 in 8 times, roughly, those things are problems. And this is another one that I'm going to start by showing you in a few minutes, that you don't need to use three-dimensional displays unless there's information in that display. And while that only occurred 9% of the time in PDFs, I see it all the time in PowerPoint presentations that people tend to put 3D graphs in and nobody can read them. And I'll see whether you can when I show you a simple example. And there's a bevy of others that came up that I'm happy to share with you if you really want to get sophisticated with these graphic principles. Now, I point these out not so much to show you examples of every one of them today, but just that this journal isn't really much different than many of the others that I read in the health sciences, and people have trouble with a lot of these ideas because they seem to be using graphic displays that are automatic when they go to get them, but they don't think about the communication that they're trying to do with their graphic display. So let's briefly go over a little bit of terminology that I'm going to use. By the way, these are articulated well in the handout, and there's even a picture in the handout that I'm not planning to show you because I couldn't get a very good visual image ready last night. But the data label is where you have a plot point and you might put a number next to it. A key is the information that goes between the data labels and some grouping. A marker is a symbol that you put in a graphical display, such as a dot or a square or a triangle, and you might fill those in. The vertical scale is sometimes called the y-axis. The horizontal scale is often called the x-axis. And sometimes, but not often enough, it's a good idea to put in a referent line, particularly for those of you who want to display a hypothesis test. If your null hypothesis happens to be 0 for a particular statistic, then you might want to put that line in for the graph that's going to support that hypothesis. There may be a scale line, and I'm not going to show you an example of that today. That's a little more sophisticated to be able to create. The data region is this part that's inside the 4 boundaries of a graphic. The title is that tells people about what's being plotted. The legend is the coding system. Tick marks are the little things that stick in or out from the graph, and you should always put them out, never put them in. And the tick mark label is the number or symbol or whatever is attached to it to tell you how to decode the graph. So those are just some terms, and I may inadvertently use them assuming that you know about them, but I will try to point them out as we go through some of the examples. Now, the major strategy for creating good graphs are listed in these basic ideas. Now, I don't know about you people, but when I first did my first graph, it was on a piece of graph paper that I did with a ruler and a pencil. And if I made a mistake, I had to draw it over again. And I often didn't like to do a second or third version of it because it took me too long to do it. However, nowadays, with reasonable statistical software and graphical software, we can do multiple graphs of exactly the same data. Indeed, I'm going to show you some different ways of displaying the data and see which ones you find better to be able to do it. So you should be thinking of iteration. In other words, doing multiple graphs, putting a bunch of them out, choosing the best amongst them, and maybe even getting some feedback on it before you use it in your presentation or in your paper in particular. And I don't think a lot of people do this because they're still hung up with the way they learned to do their first graph with a piece of graph paper. So, and I know that's going to change because there are a series of graphic packages that are just being shown right now that you're going to see available, that people will start creating graphs before they do any data analysis. That will be the first step of their analysis, and then they'll do the complicated statistical things after the fact. The second major point about this is that you should match the goals of your communication to the kind of plot that you choose. In other words, rather than doing a knee-jerk reaction to a graph because you've seen it in previous articles, you should ask the question, what do I want my reader to be able to see when they look at this graph? If they look at it and can see the message that I think is important, then you've matched your goal with the plot. If they have trouble figuring out what you're talking about, then you've not chosen a very good plot to do that. And I'll show you some examples of that and how we can improve on that as we go. The next thing that you want to worry about is to try to get the thing that puts out the true message that you think is supported by your study or your data. And forget about all of the artifacts, the glitz, the special symbols, the color. There's a bunch of other features that you don't want it to cloud up the picture, because those things, because we're humans, we're easily distracted. Our eyes are very easy to screw up with throwing in artifacts in our graph. And I'm going to show you some examples of that and show you some results of some human perception research that tells you why some of these things are important. The next principle that we're going to look at is something called flexibility. In other words, you may want to start adapting your graph and hope your software can do what you want it to do to be able to show quite easily the kind of thing that you think is necessary. So I'm going to show you a few examples of that, and you can then decide whether you think that particular graph is more helpful than an alternative way of being able to do it. And finally, your reader should be able to interpret that graph in a relatively straightforward way. And there are some journals that pay a lot more attention to this particular feature than a lot of others. For example, I will mention both Science and Nature. They tend to make sure that every graph has a very good legend underneath it, and it explains all of the symbols properly, so that if somebody goes and copies that graph and they copy the legend with it, they'll get the explanation. But if the people don't do that very well, it's very difficult for some people to interpret the graph when they see it on its own, unless it's in the context of the paper. So that's what we mean by interpretability. Now I'm going to come back to these ideas in a variety of ways with some examples. So before I go on to the reasoning behind it, does anybody have a question at this point? Okay, I didn't see anybody, putting their hand up or anything like that, so I'm going to go ahead with the next graph, which shows what are turned out to be what are the kinds of basic principles behind graphic perception. These are the result of a whole series of human perception experiments conducted by people at AT&T and before its research group got sold off to all kinds of different vendors. It was done mainly by Bill Cleveland and his people. And it's all based on proper decoding of graphs, and I'm going to just show you them one at a time just so that you can try to pay attention to them. The first of these is that for humans it's easy to perceive position on a common line. So if that's the focus of your graph, then it's easy for people to properly decode it. We'll show you some examples for these in a minute. The second thing is The second most important thing is if you can't do it on a common line, then you should make sure that the lines are identical even though they're not aligned. In other words, make sure the scales are the same. So if you've got two more graphs that you're trying to compare or two more responses, make sure you do them in identical non-aligned scales. And there are lots of examples in the literature where people don't pay attention to this because they let the software choose the axis lengths, and that makes it very difficult for people to decode properly. So this is sometimes forced on you, but indeed it's not hard to be able to do with most good graphics packages. The third thing is communicating length is a relatively simple concept, and that, while it's positioned after these other two, you can do this with the length of a bar in a bar graph, or the length of a line in a line graph, or you can use it with a lollipop graph. But it shows you the length of something. Humans are pretty good at judging that when they're put side by side with each other, and they do a reasonable job as long as there aren't some distractors added to the length that I'll talk about a little later. The third thing that's down on the list here, number 4, is called angle and slope. And this is what's behind why people have trouble dealing with pie charts. As a matter of fact, I don't think you ever need to use a pie chart. It's a bad graph in most situations. And I'm not going to show you any of the reasons why today, but one of the reasons is humans cannot judge angles very well. And when it comes to slopes of lines and things like that, they have a very difficult time interpreting what the numbers are that are associated with that, and even doing comparisons of these things. And the experiments show that it's way down the list in terms of some of these basic principles, so that you ought to think about that and try to look for a better graph when you're trying to display something. The next one is area, and the reason for this is that this is something that people have a difficult time figuring out various comparisons. So if you've got a bunch of circles with different areas, then people have trouble deciding relative magnitude of them. If they're close to each other, they can decide if one is bigger than the other, but it's very difficult for them to perceive any numbers associated with it. Humans just don't do this task very well, and their error rates are often 3 and 4 times what they would be if you just put a number or a point on a common line at the top. The next one down even gets worse. It's volume, and this happens when people get into three-dimensional displays or try to use some kind of symbol like a person or something that has changes in size, where you try to draw them in 3 dimensions. And communicating volume, again, is more difficult for humans to be able to figure out. They can perceive differences between them, but they can't perceive numerical values at all very well. They have an awful time of decoding this information. And the thing that's at the bottom of the list are things related to color. Now, this is for a variety of reasons: color, hue, saturation, and density. Well, sometimes color is helpful. The best thing to think about doing is communicating in black and white. And this is for the main reason is certainly if you're male, you have an increased risk of having some color blindness, and that means that some of these issues are going to be some added difficulties for you. But secondly, certainly most of the photocopiers that we have around, if you produce a graphic that has color in it and go and copy it as an article, then you can't see most of the color issues because they show up of some vague amount of black and white that's very difficult to see the original color. So unless you've got a color printer, you've lost the issue here. And humans have a very difficult time of distinguishing between different shades of color and even different major colors. Although it makes a graph look pretty, it increases the difficulty of somebody perceiving the accurate information. Now, if you start out with a graph that is using areas, then you can improve your graph by moving it up this set of principles to one of the simpler kinds of ways of displaying it. Instead of talking about area, go to slope, or sorry, go to length, or put it as 2 positions on identical non-aligned lines, or putting it on a common line. And certainly if you've got volume, try to reduce the dimensionality if you can to put it into a single number that you can put on a common line. That's always a good principle. So move it up. If you're tempted to use color, try it in black and white and see if you can still get the message to come across, because that's what a good number of people are going to see. Maybe not on the computer screen, but certainly when they go to print it, it often is that way unless you've got color printers. So as a general principle in improving your graph, if you see something that's down the list here in terms of ideas with your graphic display, then try to move it back up the line and you'll get a better graph. Okay, well, now what I want to do is to shift over to some examples and see what you can learn from it by painting some of the pictures of what you should be doing with it. And then we're going to concentrate on a bunch of different graphs to be able to make these points. So the first of them is label your right-hand axis when you think it's going to be useful to you, and sometimes even the top x-axis can be helpful if the data in the data region are up towards the right-hand side of your graph. For sure, consider doing these things. If there are some special computations that need to be done to show comparisons properly, such as comparisons between groups, do them for the people. Don't show things as descriptive graphs. This is a big problem with a good number of publications. They stay at the level of descriptive statistics and don't go to the level of inferential statistics. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this sort of thing, what you might do as an alternative graph. Use correct variation measures. For example, one of the things that a lot of people like to do is use I clicked on the wrong one here. They want to use a standard error. Now, those of you who know what I'm talking about statistically, this is always smaller than a standard deviation, and so it makes everybody's data set look a lot better, where it may be almost all the time the most inappropriate statistic to display. And so I think you should leave off the variation measures, and I know a lot of journals like to see them, but I haven't yet found anybody who can properly decode these. They think they understand it, but I've never found the error rates approach 50–60% when I ask people to estimate how big the variability is. So that doesn't work very well. So I find leaving it off from the graphic display and making a comment on it or replacing it with other information is a lot better. If you're going to compare groups, such as two groups in your study, an experimental and control group, make sure that they're close together in the graphic display, not far apart. The farther apart they are in your graphic display, the harder it is for humans to do the comparison. So you may want to redraw the graph, remember the iteration concept, for a particular comparison and see whether or not you can do that. Now, this may mean that you're going to increase the number of graphs for your publication, but now that we are doing more and more computerized databases backing up journals, there's an option there to insert more of these graphs that could be helpful for particular questions. So I think that while many early journals used to only allow you to publish one graph or fewer than the number of tables, now you can get a lot of them in there because we've got the space to be able to back it up. Quite often numbers should be outside the graph in the legend and not labeled in there, although the odd one sometimes makes a particularly good point. I'm not going to show examples of it today because I'm not going to hook it up with a live database, and sometimes that's helpful in a presentation that I often will use when I'm teaching it with a statistical package such as Minitab. You may want to use a second or a subsequent graph if you've got another conclusion. So with multiple conclusions, you might want to say, the graph doesn't work well for that conclusion, let's get a better graph for it. So each important conclusion of your study, you might want to consider making a special graph for it, rather than having one graph, usually descriptive, trying to provide information and insight to the reviewer, and in fact it doesn't do a very good job of that very well. And then there's another one when you're starting to compare two commensurate variables. By that I mean two different ways of measuring the same kind of phenomena. And indeed, one of the things that you should be considering doing, and I'll show you how people normally graph it, they graph one variable against the other with a 45-degree line going from the left up to the right. And in fact, a better graph, and we'll show you why, is what's called the difference between the two versus the mean of the two. Some call this a Bland-Altman plot, although it really originated with John Tukey in his 1977 book on exploratory data analysis. When you're dealing with tick marks, make sure they go out rather than in. If they go in, they may be perceived as covering up a data point, and so you might miss an important outlier in your data, and I've seen lots of examples of that. I'm not going to show you that today. I'm just going to say always try to have your tick marks out. If your graphic package doesn't allow you to do it, change your graphic package. If you're dealing with time series kind of data that has fluctuations up and down in it, and I'm not going to show this, then you want to try to choose the scale of your graph in such a way that the lines that are going up or down are as close to 45 degrees as possible, because it makes it easier for people to figure out the pattern. I'm not going to show you an example of that today, but there are lots of examples in the references like that. Make sure your labels are horizontal, because people read horizontally, not vertically. Avoid dimensions with no information. This is the issue about going to second and third dimensions when nothing is there. Then for sure don't put that stuff in your graph, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. Avoid a lot of shading or cross-hatching or what are called Moyer effects, because people get misled by all of these things. So they don't turn out to be graphical aids, they turn out to be graphical impediments, and people miscode the graph as a result of using these features. But a lot of packages like to stick them in because they look pretty, but in fact pretty means it's difficult to understand it. Avoid stacking by creating separate graphs. So if you've got things like percentages that sum to 100%, don't stack them up as bar graphs, because people can make up the bottom one or the sum of them, but they can't figure out the intermediate groups at all from a graphic display like that. So it's a bad choice of a graph. And when it comes to coloring, this is the worst one. I'm not going to show you it today because I don't like it, but you may want to experiment with whether the color of the letters that you're using on the background actually show up in the screen that you're trying to display. Certainly the worst for me is red on a blue background. Almost always it washes out badly. So those are some pearls. Those are reinforced with lots of references in the handout. And now let's get into a graph. Now here's an opportunity for you to see whether you understand this graph. So I'm going to give you anybody who would like to take a chance on. Would somebody like to try to tell me what they see in this graph? So nobody's put up their hand yet, and nobody's answered it in the comment button. So what I'm going to do for you is show you what the problem is. Group B is down here on the label at the bottom. And there's no unit of measurement there. It's very deliberate. Thank you very much for that comment. But when you try to take this graph and decide to put it over here where the numbers are, you have to decide which piece of the bar you're going to use to do it. Now if you do that and drag it over here, then they've done this graph thing by twisting it, and it looks like the number projects to something a little less than 2. However, this, by the way, was drawn in Excel, and in 3 dimensions. You see these bars have length, width, and height, and it's the height that is the important thing. In fact, this whole display isn't simply the letters A, B, C and the numbers 1, 2, 3, but you can see there's a perception that the line that's connected with 2 is above the data point, so that you perceive that this value of B is lower than 2. And this one's lower than 3, and this one's lower than 1, so that all 3 of the actual numbers that were stuck into the database to create this graph have a graph that gives you a perception that something funny is happening. Now what's there is you have to draw a line from there to the front edge is how this 2 matches up to that. But most humans, unless they know this particular procedure, will make a mistake in decoding this kind of graph. So, by the way, this Excel doesn't prevent you from doing this graph, like Minitab does, for example. It won't allow you, Minitab won't allow you to create this graph in 3 dimensions if there isn't a 3rd dimension in the data, whereas Excel allows it very easily. So here's a better way. Even using Excel, we can go on to a bar chart, which is exactly the same set of labels, A, B, and C, and this time the numbers line up exactly with 1, 2, and 3, as you can see over here perfectly, because it's done as a 2-dimensional display. And while this is an artificial example and there are no units associated with this, and we didn't label this y-axis, you can see because there are background lines connecting up the numbers to make it fairly easy to decode the data. And while this right-hand axis is not labeled because of this set of lines, it's fairly easy to figure out what the responses are for this graph. The people agree that this one is better to figure out what happened than the previous one. So I see one happy face and a few others that are there. So this is a feature that you should watch out for, particularly if you're going to use Excel, because it doesn't have any of these things built into it for preventing bad graphs from being generated. Now let me just show you one other choice that you could have made with Excel. This is what's known as a spider plot. It now turns A, B, and C as if they're into 3 different dimensions. And you can see on the A-axis there's a 1 up here, but it's a faint 3-dimensional triangle that goes from 1 to 2 to 3, but it's hard to see all of these sorts of things, and some people like to think of this as a spider web, and while this is not particularly good for a low number of dimensions, for some that you have sort of 5 or higher, this kind of a graphic display is not a bad one to have, and Excel allows you to do it fairly easily, but you want to try and add some extra features to it to make sure that your reader can understand this graph. Because without some explanation, this graph becomes difficult for the average person to perceive that this light blue line here, and if I put them in black and white, you might miss what the whole graph was about, because all of them look like different sets of triangles there, and you might not even perceive that this one is the intended data display, because the graph labels of all of the different triangles here are heavier in look than that, so you'd want to make this line much more dominant in the graph to have it stand out and become the data display, rather than all of the artifacts around this graph being the dominant part of the image, and that's the thing that a human eye concentrates on. So that's a very simple set of 3 graphs that shows some of the problems that are going to come up. So let's now look at another one. It's a different data set this time, and this time I'm using Minitab. And I got a small set of data that has a bunch of data values that are created on computers. And so what this is called is a dot plot of the price of the computer. This is the label of the graph. And along this axis you can see that the x-axis has price in it, and there are some tick marks that are coming out from the graph space, which is on the inside. And then in fact, there are little regroupings here, and every time that there is a computer there, it's a dot that goes up vertically. So there's 1 here, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, and so on. And so there's a bunch of dots. So it looks like, for the most part, most of the prices here are sort of below 4,000, but there are some really high ones over here that go up over $7,200. And I'll reference this data set for you in case you want to try regraphing some of these features in your favorite package. But some people like this kind of graph. I've certainly seen it clinically. But it's one that just displays the raw data at what's called the atom level of the data, because each of them, there are 35 data points here, and each of them is a separate point on this graph, so you're not losing any of the data. So that's not a bad graph to show the prices for this particular sample of computers, but it doesn't have any y-axis label to it because it's just a bunch of dots that are counted up, so it's up to you to figure out what the height of each of those are. Now certainly some of the fairly sparse ones are easy to see, but you probably have to pay attention there. I think counting up to 4 is not too hard, but if this were 20 or 30, you might make a mistake in figuring out how big that group was. But it looks like there's a lot of people that, you know, got up to $4,000 and didn't want to get over it. And you'll see that that may not be the right interpretation of the data when I show you a different data display. So this is one that's I've seen quite commonly, but it doesn't have any y-axis label on it. As you can see, the x-axis is labeled. And you can see there's a lot of extra zeros in here because we're now talking about, you know, $2,400. So you can see the redundancy of having all these extra zeros. This would be the kind of thing where a couple of zeros dropped off with those tick mark labels and put down here as a legend, as, you know, as times 1,000, would be probably a better graph and easier for people to understand. Now, it's possible to replace that, and if I had my Minitab up and running, I could redo that and then put a footnote in here to say that these numbers on the x-axis were times 1,000, essentially, so that you could put that in, and yet it would make it a little easier to think about what the key changing data points were as it went across. Now Minitab made all of the choices for everything that's here. So I didn't attempt to do any editing of this, which Minitab allows you to do, and that, if you really want to fix up your graphs, means that you're going to have to learn how to do some of those things with your graphics package. If it doesn't allow you to do those changes, you're not going to be able to adapt your graph for your reader or your audience. And you have to think that you want to do that because you want to make sure they can see in the graph the key message that you want to put across to people. Okay, let's look at a little more complicated one. This is an alternative display. This is known as a stem and leaf display, or sometimes it's called a stem and leaf plot. And I used the same sort of variable. It's still doing the price. There's a sample of 35. It makes out what's a leaf unit of 100. Remember, that dropped the 2 zeros off of it. And then the first digit of the prices is listed here, and you notice they're done in pairs. And then the second digit of it is done what's called the leaves. So in fact, these 3 items are 3 different computers, one at 20, one at 24, and a second one at 24. And you multiply each of them times 100 to be $2,400, okay? So this is a way to be able to see what's going on, and you should be able to notice that for the first digit, the leaves 0 through 4 are used, and for the second of the 2, 5 through 9 are used, so you can see whether or not all of these numbers are changing, which might have been difficult for you to see on the dot plot, and certainly you wouldn't be able to see it all in a histogram. But the thing that you remember when we were talking about the peak there, that was just before 4,000, look what's happened here is a good number of those prices are going to have 9 in them. Humans think that if you take off a cent off of a price, that it's cheaper than one that where you put them on. So all of these 9s are essentially rounded up to 4,000 in that other graphical display because that's the way it was created in Minitab. Now, this particular display I find very helpful because it allows me to see the digits in the second position. It actually displays a distribution if you rotate it 90 degrees to the left, which I'm going to do now on the next axis. And so if I actually come over here and draw a line underneath this position here, this is effectively the display that gets converted into a histogram, but the digits are here. And so if I go back to the previous one, you see you just rotated it 90 degrees, so you see the distribution going down here. And if I were to draw the line here to the left of it, this is exactly the same picture that was on the next slide. But the distribution goes out this way rather than going up from that common line. So this particular feature is a graph that's done in the terms of the first principle that was there. Even though the dot plot was also done that way, it doesn't show you as much information when you look at data. So I'm not going to explain these numbers now, but in fact I could, if anybody has a question. I'd like to get on to another principle. So you saw this one. Now if I choose to do the histogram of all of this information, up this axis here is frequency, and the numbers are here now multiples of 1,000 for the tick marks, and then now we have little area representations. And the difficult thing about this is that you don't know what the numbers represent. You've got 4,000 here, 4,000 there, so that looks like 3,000 there, sorry, so it looks like 3,500 there. They've made these categories 500 wide, and again, the software packages created the widths of each of these, and I've chosen to display the right-hand axis because there are some of them over here on the right-hand side of the data that I don't want to project it all the way over to the left-hand side to figure out what the frequency is. It's a lot easier for you to do it by moving it over to the right-hand axis. And this is an example of a graph where I've added that right-hand axis, and Minitab does allow you to do that fairly easily. I'm not going to show you how to do that today because I'm not going to hook up to Minitab. The y-axis is a count of the frequency of in each of these displays. In other words, that's what that little symbol F means. It stands for frequency. And so there's 1 here at 2,000. There are 5, although there's no 5 there, at 2,500. And those are categories that have those. So that's what that axis stands for, and it's exactly the same one on the right-hand side, although unless you want the label to be repeated over here, I normally find that people don't need it if the right-hand axis is the same as the left-hand axis. Thank you for that question. Now, here's an alternative way to be able to display this data. And so this time I'm using something called a box plot. Now, if you haven't seen this, I find this is a really good data display for information. It shows you at the top, for a start, that there are 4 computers that are much higher than the rest. This box shows the median right here, the upper quartile, the lower quartile, and these are what are known as whiskers, and they show the rest of the data that go out to what are called the inner fences for this particular plot, but it shows you the major part of the display. And this is particularly good for doing distributions of data without actually showing the shape of the distribution, but doing it in terms of actual numbers, and it's very good for comparison of groups, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But none of those other things were labeled as outliers, whereas this shows up directly in the graph that way, and as a result it makes it something that you can call attention to, and you might want to use this if you were describing this particular variable in your paper. So those are a bunch of different ways that you might have used to display exactly the same numbers. So here's what happens when I split it up by the kind of CPUs. Here's a graphical display, and they're side by side. Now I've been deliberate with this one. Minitab puts the price going up vertically. You find that as easy to read as the previous one where I had it going horizontally. It's still a box plot. It now compares the sizes of CPUs, a 386 or a 486 CPU, and you can clearly see that the prices are basically higher in this group than there are here. And there's lots of other enhancements that we could do, but this graph makes it clear that 486 prices are higher than 386 prices. Now, to fix up this graph a bit, you might have been interested in having a right-hand axis and changing this y-axis label to be horizontal. And so in the next graph, I've done both of those things, and I have control over that in Minitab. So it puts that label there. It makes it easier to read, in my opinion, and it also makes the same graph on the inside, but it has this right-hand axis label. Okay, now here's another one about relating price to the size of the hard drive that was on these computers. So again, you can see there's a very big pile of data here right at about 200, and there's one out here that's as an outlier. And again, you might have wanted to have the right-hand axis on this to see how big that number was rather than projecting it all the way over to the left-hand axis. And you might have wanted this data display to be there. Well, I'm going to do one other thing with this graph by adding a line to it to see whether or not you think a straight line to those data would be a very good way to be able to capture those data. Well, it does get the essence of the image. There's a lot of variation around that line, and this wouldn't be a very good fit, although it might not be a bad fit. But again, this one is still dominant for this particular grouping over here, and now with the right-hand label, you can see maybe it's around 6,700 or 6,800. Now, if we had Minitab available here, we can actually click on that, and it would show you the number if you wanted it. So that kind of a graph, I think, is better to be able to show the pattern if that pattern is the conclusion you would like your reader to be able to do. We didn't start with 0, so that's an important feature for you to decide about. Is it important for you to waste all of this graph space by starting your graph down at 0? I could have done so, but then all of these data points would be way above the top part of the graph. So you can call attention to that feature when you're presenting it, that the smallest data point is just a little over 2,000, and the largest one is a little under 8,000, and so you've chosen the graph image to be able to display the things that you think are important to display. If you put the 0 on the axis, then it, in fact, is going to mean that this region is going to become a very small piece of the space. I haven't drawn that. I don't mind doing that and then sending it to you later, but I can't make that change right now. So I'm going to take one more choice between things and then open up the question because we're getting close to the end. This is an example of an experiment of a 2-squared factorial design that I helped run, where we tried to take a look at patients who had neck pain as measured by the NPQ neck index. It goes as high as 30 and can go down to 0 when you have less pain. So this top group was a control group that had a mean response of 18.62, and those that actually got the pillow, notice pillow goes between no and yes on this axis, were a little bit higher, that got the pillow, and they did not get any of the exercises. But the people who got the exercises, if you started with just that, your response went up a little bit, not noticeably different there. But if you did both together, did the exercise and the pillow, this went down to 14.12. So this graph is what I call a descriptive graph. It shows you the descriptive statistics, the means for each of the groups, but it doesn't tell you whether anything is statistically significant or clinically important. And so I propose that we should be doing more of the following kind of graph, which I call an inference graph. So this PQ-NPQ scale has a 0 reference point in it. So this is a good feature to be able to stick in, a reference line. Pardon me. The minimum clinically important difference that people have established for this index is 4. And you can see then with a 95% confidence interval on the estimate of the effect of the pillow on its own, it had an estimated value that was here, and the 95% confidence interval includes 0, so clearly it's not statistically significant. I've added the p-value, and you can see that it's not close to 0.05. Pardon me. Similarly, on the exercise group, you can notice again that the 95% confidence interval includes 0, so it's not statistically significant. However, when you do both together, the impact of both has a confidence interval that excludes 0 nicely. It's quite above it. it still has the clinically important effect in there, and although we would have liked to have had it so that this whole confidence interval was above the minimum clinically important difference, it shows you that, in fact, on this graph, that this is the right sort of decision to be done clinically for people with neck pain. Do both using the proper sleeping pillow and the isometric exercises will have an effect. If you do either on their own, they don't work. So I believe this is a much more informative graph for people. I did these graphs in Minitab, by the way. I'm going to skip over these other ones and just jump to, these are a little more complicated to explain, and I don't think we've had enough time, so I just want to come to a series of questions that I think you should ask about any graph, and I'd be happy to take emails about the reasons for the other ones. You want to ask people, give this to your readers or whoever sees your graph. What do you see? See if they can see what you intended. If there are groups, can they tell if they're different or not? Are the effects clinically important? Are the effects statistically significant? Did you like the graph? Are there any suggestions that you have for improvement? And is there a better way to graph it? So I think you should do these questions every time you create a graph for a paper or a presentation and ask people about them. And indeed, in those circumstances, I think you're going to get better graphs if you pay attention to those basic principles that I talked to and have a graphic package such as Minitab carrying out your calculations. And I would say stay away from Excel because it screws things up more often than not. So I'll open it up for questions now and shut off my microphone. Either
Well, if you have any additional questions, here's the information to contact Dr. Goldsmith with. And I'd like to take the opportunity now to thank all of you for joining the webinar and thank you as well. Yes, the applause, I agree, for Dr. Goldsmith's presentation today. And thank you all for joining through the chat room and the emoticons. At the end of today's session, as we mentioned, you will be receiving the handout as well as an evaluation form. And it does have more detailed information, as Dr. Goldsmith mentioned. We would appreciate you taking a minute to complete the evaluation form. It will be with an enterable PDF format with a drop-down and text boxes, and you just simply download and save it to your computer. Once you've completed it, please email it back to us, as we really value your feedback on this session as well as any suggestions on other future sessions that you may have. And please go to the Canadian Cochrane Centre website for a description of the upcoming webinars, and there is an online module as well that's self-directed for October, but that will be from October, November, and December. We'll have sessions too. So thank you very much, and thank you very much, Dr. Goldsmith. It's been a pleasure.
Eileen, I'll stay here for a few minutes until most people have logged off in case somebody still wants to ask, okay?
That's fine with me. Yes, Maria, you have the floor with your question. You can either type it in, or else if you need the microphone, I'll close this one.
Maria, it's Charlie again. I'm on a variety of editorial boards, and for the most part they don't. They actually direct you to other graphs that appear in the journal. In other words, they're accepting a lot of bad graphs already, and they haven't really thought this through carefully. That's the reason why I set forward those principles. And they've been around for quite a few years, since 1985. And I think journals are behind the times in the quality of their guidelines that they give to people for creating graphs. They worry more about whether it's a JPEG file or whatever kind of file it is, rather than whether the graph actually communicates. And a second thing related to that is that when I review people's graphs, they said, this is the first time anybody has given me any suggestions of how to improve my graph. Everybody's published my graphs in the past, and I didn't realize how bad they were. So I think people don't pay attention to them the way they should, because they've been graph impediments, and I think we need to turn them into graphic aids to help the paper. Thank you for that reference. I'll take a look at it and see what I think of those. I wasn't aware of that because I don't normally read that journal, but I will be happy to take a look at it.